There was tension in the air aboard what was supposed to be a routine trip. The stewardess, a smirk on her lips, glided between the rows, winking dismissively at her colleagues, but her attention was drawn to one black woman sitting by the window. The flight attendant's every word, full of mockery and prejudice, cut like a knife, causing fear and tension among the passengers. No one dared to intervene. There was an anticipatory thrill in the air once this woman might have been one of them, but now she was the object of humiliation. Unaware that this black woman was the owner of the airline, the flight attendant continued her evil performance. She raised her voice, ironically asking what it was like to fly in economy class. Such insults did not go unnoticed. Every look, every whisper among the passengers read, "It's not right." What do you think happened next? Think back to the many times you have encountered bias and how it is sometimes everywhere. Write in the comments with your name and where you're watching this video from. We appreciate every word, and your support are incredibly important to us, and it's because of you that we're able to keep making this content. You help promote our channel and make it better, and we are so grateful for that. Let's get to the bottom of this horrible incident together and make the world a little kinder. Enjoy the show. In the bustling airport, among the many flights and crowds of people, a distinctive buzz of anticipation was rising. Passengers hurrying to their gates exchanged glances full of excitement and anticipation. Each of them carried in their hearts dreams of new places, adventures and encounters. But there were also those who felt uncomfortable fear of taking off, fear of being cramped, and anticipation of potential conflicts with other passengers. Amidst all the commotion at the front desk, a black woman stood out. With a confident posture and a bright but modest outfit, she seemed calm. Though there was a lot of commotion around her, she smiled quietly at the confused faces of the other passengers. But there was a shadow of fatigue in her eyes, not from the long journey, but from the endless prejudices and racial stereotypes she had encountered in her life. The small bag accompanying her was filled not only with her personal belongings, but also with ambitions, dreams and pride. She had an important meeting to attend in another city, and she was ready to make it happen. But there was more than just an air of anticipation in there. As they approached the boarding gate, whispers and chuckles were heard among the passengers, drawing attention to the stewardess, who was just finishing the last preparations. With her head held high and a slight arrogance in her voice, she winked at her colleagues and headed confidently toward the passengers. Her professional smile only superficially concealed the dislike she felt for some of them. Her eyes were already filled with prejudice when she noticed a black woman sitting by the window. The stewardess, now realizing that something more than just a routine flight was unfolding before her eyes, went about her role of teasing and humiliating. Tension was rising among the other passengers. Some of them watched with bated breath. Others tried to look away, hoping that the unnecessary interference would not turn against them. However, many were well aware that tension was building in the air, and not everyone was ready to accept what was happening. For a moment, the excitement before takeoff turned into something more threatening, and the very atmosphere of the flight foreshadowed that this was going to be more than just a flight. With the first sounds of the boarding announcement, a team of flight attendants gathered at the entrance to the cabin, preparing to greet the passengers. Their uniforms were impeccably ironed, but behind the facade of professionalism were characters that were immediately apparent. Chief among them was a stewardess named Laura, a middle-aged woman with pointed facial features, exaggerated makeup, and brown hair gathered in a severe bun. At first glance, her confidence could have been mistaken for professionalism, but in fact she radiated an arrogance that many of the passengers instantly sensed. You could read the disdain in her strained smile as she looked at the assembled passengers. She looked around the queue, her gaze lingering on the black woman sitting by the window. Laura snorted, unhappy that someone she felt didn't fit the ideal of passenger. Her voice trailed off with a note of sarcasm and slight contempt as she began to greet the passengers. "Welcome aboard our flight. I hope you chose it not only to relax, but also to learn the rules of decorum." Her comment elicited perplexed looks from many, but she only grinned as if enjoying the inappropriate comment. Laura quickly proceeded to demonstrate safety while being distracted by phrases that sounded like jokes in her head. Every time her gaze crossed the black woman's, she said something about the shortcomings of the airplane or how to look good. Each phrase wrapped in a humorous shell, but resonated with an underlying racism. The other crew members, who were also nearby, did not take their eyes off her arrogant mannerisms. Though some of them tried to remain neutral, one of the stewards. Dan, however, was becoming visibly tense. He sensed Lara was going too far, and even though he wasn't blameless in his preconceived thoughts either, he realized that her words were inappropriate. Lara continued to act as if she was allowed to do anything. She was distracted by various trifles, ignoring the passengers' requests and only showing that it was just another day at work. The passengers who witnessed her arrogance felt uncomfortable, but as before, no one dared to intervene. Each of them realized that behind the glamorous facade of the stewardess, there was something much more disturbing. When the stewardess finished her bravura announcements and turned to her colleagues with a slight smirk, her confidence only grew stronger the moment she took a step to the side. As if her confidence enveloped her, the other passengers in waiting glanced around in fascination, reminding each other of the ominous dismissiveness they had encountered. Amidst all these little incidents, the black woman who continued to sit by the window could only sigh. Holding back her emotions, she realized that her struggle was not limited to just one flight attendant. This was a moment when the excitement before takeoff was beginning to grow into something more, and the excitement in the air was already foreshadowing impending problems. The black woman seated at the window stood out among the stream of passengers filling the cabin for her intercom. Her long hair was neatly braided, and her attire, understated but stylish, showed that she was well aware of how to make an impression. Folding her hands in her lap, she looked out the porthole, enjoying the view of the clouds floating slowly outside the airport. She was immersed in her thoughts, while the hustle and bustle and tension around her reigned. But this woman's calmness did not go unnoticed. Lara, a flight attendant with an arrogant attitude, couldn't miss the opportunity to take a jab at her. Her prejudice and inappropriate comments began to show as soon as Lara approached the row where the black female passenger was seated. Lara leaned back in her seat and looked at the woman with a defiant smirk. "How much time did you spend choosing this place? Or could you just not find a more comfortable one?" she asked with obvious sarcasm, not caring how her words might hurt. Her tone was a reminder of what she had in mind to appreciate, humiliate, and take pleasure in doing so. Around them, the other passengers began to whisper, and some seemed to be holding back smiles. The black woman, named Amira, raised her head and met the flight attendant's gaze. Her face remained unruffled, though her inner emotions were simmering. She realized that Lara was just looking for a way to show her superiority. But still, that aggression hurt her. "I just wanted to enjoy a nice view," Amira replied, trying to remain calm. There was no anger or pity in her voice, just an involuntary sadness. This reaction only spurred Lara, who decided to continue her game. "I see, sometimes it's not a bad idea to just sit and stare at the clouds when you don't know how to take your chances in life," she spent, throwing another barbed glance at Amir. Her words were full of contempt, causing resentment among the other passengers, but many of them chose to remain aloof, fearing repercussions for interfering. Some passengers looked at Amira with sympathy, but others seemed to enjoy the scene, emphasizing how the flight attendant's arrogance exposed existing racism. There was a feeling in the air that the moment of watching the humiliation had become a common pastime, although it evoked conflicting feelings within everyone. Conversations about how some people just don't understand what it means to be on top of things passed by the years. Lara, noticing that some of the passengers were laughing and looking at each other, felt even more confident. She noticed how her words, full of prejudice, raised her status in the eyes of others. This feeling gave her strength, and she decided to keep attacking, ignoring the fact that her behavior looked inhumane. "You know, when I see people like you, I wonder how they deal with reality," she said, a combination of pity and contempt in her voice. "Apparently, dreaming is all you have left." With that phrase, Lara crossed the line. Many of the passengers exchanged glances, and some seemed to have a fear of what would happen next. Amira met her gaze again, but this time determination flashed in her eyes. Her back was straight and her face took on a confident expression. She knew she was on the front lines of a battle she had not asked for. With a look full of strength, she uttered, "Judgment does not define me, and your words only emphasize your uncertainty." In that moment, as silence enveloped the salon, Amira became a symbol of resilience and fortitude, despite the attacks that had fallen upon her. Lara, who hadn't expected such an answer, was stunned. Her arrogance faltered for a moment, and confusion flashed in her eyes, while the other passengers, realizing they were watching something more significant, began to support Amira with glances and silent approving gestures. There was a sense of unity in the air at that moment, though Lara's prejudice continued to hang over everything that was going on, giving the impression that the ominous shadow wasn't going to go away. After Amira's unexpected response, Lara felt her confidence begin to fray at the seams, but instead of backing down or showing a modicum of humanity, she only grinned, knowing that now that she had more and more onlookers around her, all she had to do was step up her game. The stewardess took a step back with a wry smile and headed back to her usual maneuver, humiliate. "Oh, I guess we have a real perky lady here," she said in an arrogant tone, addressing all the passengers who seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for her to continue. Lara walked around the cabin like a hunter, and her next jab was ready. "But tell me, my dear, how did you manage to rise to such heights? Surely you must be used to only dreaming of heights. But here on board, I doubt if your habits will help. Unfortunately, we all walk through the same door, not first class." These words caused some of the passengers to be displeased and embarrassed, but Lara was only spurred on by this. Her contemptuous demeanor was attracting attention. She glanced at Amira with an expression that read joy in the humiliation she was inflicting, as if she enjoyed the fact that she could rise at the expense of another. "Or do you just not understand how things work around here? Haven't you ever flown before?" The stewardess continued, winking at her co-workers and looking away from the black woman. There was a clear note of mockery in her voice, as if the very idea that Amira could be an experienced traveler was absurd. The other passengers began whispering among themselves, some of them shocked and others seeming intrigued by this game that was being played out in front of them. The feeling of awkwardness grew, and soon someone from the back rows couldn't stand it any longer. "Hey, leave her alone," shouted a man, but Lara only grinned and continued her cruel game. Look, we have a protector. It's like someone in this corner of the hall suddenly feels like a safe place," Lara said with a sneer, her voice sounding assertive and cold. She turned to Amir. "Well, someone is once again trying to get on a pedestal, but I'm afraid it's not going to work. Come on, tell us where you're from. Admit it, you're not from around here, are you?" Amira felt her heart beat faster. Every comment was like a knife stabbing into her soul, but she wasn't going to let Lara undermine her self-esteem. Instead, she decided she had to speak up, even if it was difficult. "I'm from New York," she said in a subdued but confident tone, "and I'm in the business field. I have a company, and I fly a lot, as you can see." However, Lara only grinned. "Oh, that's great, but I hope you have good experience with business associates who won't know how to handle tickets properly." Her words were full of mockery and hidden contempt, and her arrogance was becoming more and more obvious with each passing second. Despite this, Amira did not allow herself to give up. She was firm. Her voice didn't waver, and she knew that every word she said mattered. But her cabin mates couldn't seem to stay away. Some of them found it unbearable to watch this humiliating scene, but the vast majority preferred to stay away, fearing the consequences for their interference. Each of Lara's derogatory words caused a whisper among the other passengers. They began to whisper, but many simply averted their eyes, not wanting to be drawn into a situation that seemed likely to get worse. Many had an internal conflict to stand aside or to speak out against the obvious injustice. Lara, however, continued to stall, as if realizing that every word she spoke, though angry, was reinforcing her own status. Her arrogance and disdain were raining down on Amira, creating an acute sense of injustice in the air that was growing by the minute, and it foreshadowed an inevitable conflict that could eventually lead to disaster. As Lara continued her scathing attacks on Amira, the atmosphere in the cabin became increasingly tense and toxic. Her snide remarks resonated not only with her, but also with several other passengers who seemed happy to see someone who looked wrong being humiliated. Laughs and whispers filled the space, turning this flight into an arena for public condemnation. "Well, it looks like we really have a high society lady here," came the laughter from the back rows. The comment was accompanied by snide glances and chuckles, as if the entire airplane had become complicit in the drama. A sense of solidarity among those who had not experienced such treatment was clearly beginning to form. People exchanged glances, some even giggled, and one passenger shouted, "Maybe she should go home and leave flying to those who know how to behave." Lara, emboldened by this encouragement, continued her lunges with even more gusto. Exactly. I'm just shocked. She didn't ask where her private helicopter was. She said slyly, causing another burst of laughter. This time, some of the passengers even started clapping their hands, as if this was some kind of show and not a wicked baiting. Amira, sitting by the window, felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. Every laugh, every mockery penetrated her, and in the moment, she felt the weight of the racism and prejudice that had been suppressed in her soul for so long. Her face turned pale, but she still mustered all her strength not to show how much it hurt her. Lara, feeling in control of the situation, continued, "You know, we have a rule in our company. We don't allow ourselves to be rude. But with someone like you, it's hard not to be provoked. What? Can't you accept that the world isn't always going to be polite?" She laughed along with the passengers, who were already fully engaged in this performance. Her words, full of disdain and arrogance, sounded as if she held the keys to some inner comedy. Some passengers began to quietly discuss the same, whispering to each other how this is just embarrassing and you think we weren't in the 21st century. But unfortunately, none of them dared to say it out loud. Amira could not understand why they continued to stand idly by, watching this sophisticated bullying. Other thoughts came to her as she felt that despite being disrespected, she had her own values and principles that no one could take away. Her confidence, though shaken, was gradually returning. She realized that she had to make a move to regain her dignity, and her inner voice told her that she could not just sit there and tolerate it any longer. Suddenly gathering all her resolve, Amira rose from her seat and looked directly at Lara. But this attempt to bring things to a finale led to laughter again as someone in the crowd shouted, "Oh, she's made up her mind? Let's see, let's see." Lara only grinned, knowing that her kingdom of arrogance wasn't going to fall so easily. She laughed in Amira's face, while the other passengers continued to spur her on with their comments. "So, what's it like to be in your shoes when no one takes you seriously?" The laughter seemed to grow louder and louder, as if the whole plane had united in this sinister chorus of hatred. Resentment was in the air, and everyone present, including Lara, realized that there was more behind this cruelty than just the flight attendant's arrogance. It was an ideology that fed on fear and racism, one that had gone unnoticed for too long. Amira took a deep breath, feeling all eyes, including her own, turned to her as if she were on a stage. Now, with the flame of determination burning within her, she knew she had to speak up not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced such a thing. In that moment, she made a decision that would change her life forever, and despite the laughter behind her back, she was no longer going to remain a silent victim. Amira stood surrounded by laughter and ridicule, like a trap from which there was no easy way out. Her emotions raged inside her: anger, resentment, and confusion, but outwardly she remained calm and unruffled. Her heart was racing, but she knew the most important thing right now was to keep her composure. Every look, every word she heard made the situation worse, and she felt a crowd gathered around her, eager to see her fall. Gathering her strength, Amira inhaled deeply, letting the air engulf her lungs and give her the confidence she had been looking for so long. She knew that each of them wanted to see her reaction, to justify their own biases and hatred. But was this really what she wanted? To surrender in front of the crowd, letting them leave her in the shadows? She sensed it wasn't all that simple. She bit her lip, realizing that everything depended on her now. "I won't let you break me," she screamed through her head, her inner voice growing louder. Amira decided that her words would be more powerful than the laughter and ridicule that surrounded her. With collected determination, she said, "You know, no matter how much you try to humiliate me, it won't change the fact of who I am and what I've accomplished." Her voice sounded confident, and at that moment the laughter around her died down, as if some magical expectation hung in the air. Some of the passengers, who had been giggling earlier, began to exchange perplexed looks, not expecting such a reaction. "I own an airline myself, and believe me, I will not allow myself to be humiliated by someone who works for me," Amira added, her eyes sparkling with the power she was beginning to feel. The phrase had the effect of a bomb going off. Whispers were heard in the cabin. The passengers could not believe their ears. Amira's words had become the weapon she used to break the wall of prejudice that had been built around her. Lara, who had lost her usual control, turned pale, but her arrogance still kept her afloat. "Oh, I'm not sure you understand what it means to own an airline. I'm sure you were just named that to cover up your true abilities." Her attempts at defiance sounded increasingly unconvincing, and because of that, Lara was trapped. She didn't know how to respond to Amira's words, and her laughter could no longer be heard. Nevertheless, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. The passengers who had previously supported Lara began to think about what role they were playing in this situation. Some of them finally realized that they were watching a cruel humiliation. Doubt began to appear on their faces, which meant that Lara's confidence was shaken. Amira, feeling the strength growing in her, continued, "We all have a story, and your hatred only points to your own fears and insecurities. I will not let your anger overshadow my confidence." Her voice sounded strong, and now some of the passengers began to praise her, raising their hands in approval. "We are all here to fly towards our goal, not serve to entertain others," she finished, her eyes glistening with exertion and determination. Emotions overwhelmed her, and despite her collectedness, tears came to her eyes. But they were not tears of weakness, but tears of strength. Amira knew that in this moment she was not only fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt humiliated, for everyone who had struggled with bias. Lara, who had lost her confidence, didn't know how to respond to such sincerity. She just stood there, her anger and contempt slowly receding, giving way to misunderstanding and confusion. The passengers around them began to rethink their own actions and words, and some began to openly express support for Amira. They were no longer laughing, but began to discuss a situation that they felt was going too far. Amira realized that she had broken the barrier, and that her words and courage could be the beginning of change. This struggle, though difficult, was bearing fruit. Her inner turmoil was no longer unattended to, and she knew that something important had happened in this moment. Times had changed, and she was ready to fight any storm that might arise ahead. There was still a tense silence in the air, as if every passenger realized that they had witnessed something unusual. Some Saturday in their seats, frowning with shock. Others tried to pretend not to hear, immersed in their phones or magazines. But deep down they knew that what was happening was more than just an altercation between a stewardess and a passenger. Mike, sitting in the front row, watched all this with obvious concern. Waves of anger and shame were rising in his soul. "Why am I silent? Why didn't any of us stand up for ourselves?" he thought, unable to contain the thought of how he would feel if he were in Amira's shoes. He had always considered himself an open-minded and tolerant person, but now he couldn't escape the guilt of his inaction. "We should have done something," he ran through his head, and with each passing moment, his own silence seemed more and more treacherous. Tamara, the woman in the middle of the cabin, also caught every word spoken by the flight attendant. She had been raised in a multicultural family and had always been proud of her diverse heritage. But now fear gripped her. "If I say something, what if they pay attention to me?" She realized that racism was not just an issue that could be set aside, but the need to protect the person being bullied also made her fearful. This struggle between morality and self-preservation tormented her, and she felt the tension clenching her chest. Gradually, the passengers began to exchange glances, realizing that what they were witnessing was not just humiliation, it was humiliation based on racism. However, everyone realized that someone like Amira could have been among them, and that thought was frightening. But perhaps even more frightening was that racism existed around them, among them, and no one wanted to take responsibility. Tom, a solid businessman sitting closer to the back of the plane, berated himself for not intervening. He had always praised himself for being politically correct, but now he realized that the right words didn't matter if you were silent. Thoughts flashed through his mind. "But if I say something, what if it just makes things worse?" Nevertheless, as he watched Amira show courage despite her worries, he felt determination building in his heart. Maybe if they all united, it would change the course of events. The people sitting closer to the window row couldn't help but notice how Amira's face was showing signs of fatigue, but also of strength. Feeling her strength, she herself became a symbol of resisting prejudice. And the other passengers, sensing this, began to wonder, how could we not have noticed before that this was happening right in front of our eyes? At this stage, many of them had the same question on their minds. Why didn't we become defenders? Now that they began to realize the magnitude of the problem, their inaction seemed an even greater burden. Some of them began to realize that racism was not just a problem of others. It was a problem that they had to address together. Amira, though she felt her strength draining, knew that every tear she shed, every word she spoke, and every action she took could be the spark that ignited the fire of change. She noticed as some of the passengers began to whisper quietly, discussing what was happening. Who would have thought that a place like this airplane could be met with such cruelty? Whispered one woman to another. These whispers, though quiet, were full of confusion and understanding. However, most remained silent observers, unwilling to intervene. They realized that every time they chose to remain silent, they became part of the problem, and this made them feel internally uncomfortable. They wanted to stand up for themselves, but fear of the possible consequences of what might happen if they spoke out against the system held them captive. Thus, throughout the flight, the atmosphere remained tense. Some passengers continued to watch the scene where Amira confronted anger without bending, while others searched their hearts for the courage to speak out against racism and prejudice. But in that moment, none of them could say what their choice would be or when they would finally decide to act. The situation in the airplane cabin was heating up like steam in a kettle ready to explode. Lara, despite the silence around her, continued to press Amira, not noticing that her insults were becoming more and more vicious and provocative. She didn't realize that her actions could cause not only anger, but consequences that could affect the entire team and the company as a whole. You don't think you can just stand out among all of us, do you? The stewardess continued, her voice sounding as arrogant as if she were a goddess on Olympus. Lara obviously did not realize that at this moment, she was not just humiliating one woman, but was exposing her own ignorance and inability to accept differences. Her verbal attacks, initially intended as light jokes, became more and more aggressive. Maybe you don't know it yet, but there are rules in our society, and you're not one of them, Lara added with a sneer. Her eyes glittered with hatred, and she looked as if she didn't believe her own words, but she kept saying them anyway, increasingly out of touch with reality. Amira, feeling the anger begin to boil up inside, knew she couldn't just sit back and watch. You're mistaken if you think I'm going to let you run this flight, she replied, and her voice sounded clear, with notes of determination. This was the moment when she made her decision. There could be no more silence. Lara, however, blinded by her hatred and arrogance, was unwilling to back down. Look, I'm not going to listen to lessons on how to behave from someone like you. It looks like you just don't understand that your seat is always the back of the plane. She snapped again, and her words were a real jab. The passengers in the cabin began to glance around nervously, many of them feeling the pressure building. Mike finally realized that he couldn't stay away. Look, this is getting too much. We're all here for one purpose, to get to our destination. None of us have the right to humiliate the others, he said, his voice quiet but confident. At this point, the tension was built into a fever pitch. Lara, catching his gaze, portrayed a grin. Funny how you try to defend someone who isn't even capable of normal behavior. You think we just have to put up with people like her? Her words caused a few passengers to laugh again, but not as loudly as before. Some were beginning to realize that it just wasn't funny. Meanwhile, Amira felt her confidence begin to waver. Lara continued to press her, trying to break her spirit. You just don't understand how hard it is for me to work here when people like you take other people's places, she said. And at that moment, Amira saw that her anger only spurred the stewardess, who still hadn't realized the consequences of her words. Feeling that time was running out, Amira knew she had to do something drastic. She turned to Mike, who had already spoken in her defense. Thank you for supporting me, she said gratefully. Realization sparkled in her eyes. They weren't alone. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound in the cabin. The airplane shook slightly, as if to punish disobedience. It was just a strong air current, but for the passengers it became a symbol, as if the sky itself was responding to what was happening. And as Lara continued her tirade, someone in the back row finally decided to intervene. It was like a match lit in dry hay. You have to stop. This is not normal, the man shouted, his voice sounding harsh and confident. His words pierced the silence, and now all eyes were fixed on him. Every passenger suddenly felt that they were part of something bigger than just a passenger flight. Amira, feeling this support, began to gather her inner strength. Lara, realizing that her superior position was beginning to fray at the seams, stopped talking abruptly. She looked at Amira again with hatred, but now that hatred seemed more desperate. The situation had reached a boiling point, and everyone realized that there was no turning back ahead. The tension that filled the cabin foreshadowed the storm, and each of the passengers, though afraid, knew they had to take a stand. Amira decided that despite her fear and the possible consequences, she would no longer remain silent. This was her time. As the tension in the cabin continued to rise, Amira felt the memories begin to roll over her in waves. In those moments, as her eyes met the bewildered looks of the passengers, she realized that she needed to open her heart and share the story that had brought her to this moment. She began to speak, her voice becoming more confident, and now it sounded like a melody full of experience and passion. "You know, I wasn't always who I am now. My life has been full of struggles, and it was those struggles that shaped me as a person," she said, sinking into her memories. Amira recalled her childhood when she was the only black girl in her class. Every day, she faced ridicule and disparaging glances. Her parents, immigrants, came to the country in search of a better life, but they often had to deal with prejudice and racism. She remembered her mother taking her to the library every Saturday where she could read books about strong and brave women who fought for their rights. These stories inspired her, but unfortunately, the reality was much harsher. "I remember being teased at school for the color of my skin and for not being able to speak slang like everyone else. I was smart, but no one liked that. I tried to fit in, but I always stayed on the fringes. People thought I had no talent and would never succeed," she continued, her voice becoming more and more emotional. Amira remembered her decision as a teenager. She would fight for herself and for those who did not have a voice. She knew that bias and racism would be her constant companions, but she wasn't going to give up. She began participating in social movements, advocating for the rights of women and people of color, and at every step she learned to be strong. "My parents always told me that I had to be twice as good to prove my worth, and I followed that rule. I went to university, became one of the best students, and eventually started my own airline," she said proudly, her voice sounding like thunder. It was her accomplishment, and she knew it was worth all the hardships she had faced. Amira looked at her companions and saw that many of them were listening to her with genuine interest. She went on to talk about how her struggle was not an easy one. "Every time I went for an interview, I knew that my competitors were not just top professionals, but people of privilege who didn't have to face the same bias. I knew that my skin color would be used against me, and it made me angry and afraid," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "But I kept fighting. I did everything I could to prove that I was not only worthy, but also capable of creating something of my own. When I launched my company, it was like a moment of victory not just for me, but for everyone who faced bias," she said, and her voice grew stronger. Amira could feel her story resonating in the hearts of her passengers. Meanwhile, Lara, realizing that her insults were no longer supported, stood like a statue with a sullen expression on her face. Amira looked at her and realized that many like her never realize what others go through, but she decided not to let that distract her from her true purpose. "I'm here to show you that no preconceived notion can break a person if they don't let it happen themselves, and I won't let you make me feel insecure," Amira said, and there was a sense of strength as well as sincerity in her words. Now, as she shared her story, she saw that many of the passengers began to reflect on their own experiences. Some whispered to each other, realizing that they had also had to face various forms of bias and humiliation. With every word Amira spoke, she not only protected herself, but also helped others realize that they were all part of the same struggle. She continued to speak, feeling the power of her spirit penetrate the hearts of those who listened. This was not just her story, it was the story of everyone who has ever felt isolated and humiliated. "I'm here because I believe in change. I am here because each of us has the right to respect and dignity," she finished, and the silence in the cabin was replaced by excitement. It wasn't just a fight for her, it was a fight for each of them, and she knew that it was in moments like these that a person could truly be strong. As soon as Amira finished telling her story, the cabin was dead silent. The passengers, as if mesmerized, were digesting her every word when, suddenly, the silence was broken by another sharp comment from Lara. "Well, look, real strength and confidence doesn't require any big show," the stewardess said, her voice filled with contempt. Lara looked at Amira defiantly, her words carrying all the anger she had been building up. You just want everyone to feel sorry for you, but there's nothing dignified about it. Maybe if you work more on yourself instead of wasting your time complaining, you wouldn't be seen as some kind of victim, she added with an arrogant smirk. Mike and Tamara exchanged worried glances. Both of them felt the atmosphere heating up even more. Some of the passengers, still silent, began to realize that Laura was not just an angry stewardess, she was the embodiment of the bias that many had encountered in their lives. Amira, feeling the waves of anger begin to rise in her chest again, decided she couldn't let Laura break her confidence. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm just sharing my truth, she replied, trying to keep her voice calm, but her heart was pounding with anger and shame rising up inside her like a storm. Your truth, it's just a set of complaints, Laura continued, ignoring Amira's words. The harshness in her voice only emphasized her inability to understand that the disagreement between them was deeper than a simple feud. You don't seem to know how to behave when it comes to real work. We're all trying here, and you're just turning everyone against you with your tears, she added, and her words pierced the atmosphere of the plane like a knife. It was a real attack not just on Amira, but on her whole life, on all the accomplishments she had built up while fighting against prejudice. Suddenly, Amira felt tears come to her eyes. She never thought she could face such cruelty in a moment when she was trying to be open and sincere. But at that moment, she saw many of the passengers begin to nod approvingly, and it gave her strength. I know I am not alone. I know I have people behind me, she thought, and, gathering her courage, continued, You are right about one thing, this life takes work, but it also requires understanding and respect. And that's exactly what I lack from you. Laura, sensing her words beginning to leave a mark on the passengers' minds, tried to regain the upper hand. It just means you can't deal with reality. Maybe it's time to look in the mirror and realize that your complaining isn't the solution. Her words again elicited chuckles among the group of passengers who were still cheering Laura on. But this time the chuckles sounded less confident. Someone from the back row, an elderly man, said, Aren't you ashamed to demean a person who is genuinely sharing her story? It was Laura's first challenge, and she felt her confidence begin to crack. Amira, noticing that someone was finally ready to speak up against the rudeness, continued, I am not a victim. I am a woman who fights back. I'm here to show everyone that even in the most difficult situations, it's important to remain resilient. We should not be silent when we see injustice. Although fear still plagued her heart, she felt her words awaken a spirit of resistance among the passengers. Gradually, the atmosphere began to change. Even those who had been snickering earlier began to wonder how wrong what they were witnessing was. Laura, realizing that her tactics were no longer working, took a step back, but only to try to take control again. Oh, of course we all have to advocate for victims' rights. It's fashionable right now, she threw in sarcastically. Her attempt to humiliate Amira was just another display of her weakness. As if on cue, almost every passenger in the cabin suddenly felt the need to speak up. Let's just put biases aside. We all deserve respect, said one of the women in the third row, her voice firm. This time the support came from different parts of the cabin. Passengers began to discuss how they had faced bias in their lives and how important it was to unite against it. Amira felt an inner warmth fill her soul. It was what she had dreamed of unity, of understanding. Though Laura continued to insult, her words no longer had the power they used to, and no matter how hard she tried, her successful attacks on Amira were losing their power. Amir's struggle was becoming more visible by the minute, and determination was awakening within her. She knew that now, as voices of support began to spring up around her. It was her story and her experience that could be the beginning of real change. Despite the growing excitement, there was silence in the airplane cabin again, as if everyone was waiting for fate itself to intervene in this confrontation. Amira, sensing the support of the passengers, continued to stand her ground boldly, but the anxiety in the eyes of the other passengers was noticeable. As they gathered, they exchanged glances full of embarrassment and fear. Many of them realized that watching this scene was not only unpleasant but also unfair. However, their inner torment did not allow them to interface. Each of them struggled with their own fears, afraid of the consequences of their intervention in the conflict. What if I make a mistake? What if that flight attendant gets back at me for my support? These thoughts crept into their minds, causing them to shut down. Some of the passengers breathed a sigh of relief when they sensed that someone had dared to support Amira, but someone else, more cowardly, turned to his neighbor in a whisper. "Don't get involved. It could get dangerous." These words, though spoken in a low voice, once again created an atmosphere of tension, as if it were an invisible thread binding everyone. With each passing moment, the excitement in the cabin grew. Some coughed quietly, some looked out the window, avoiding each other's gaze, while Amira continued to speak. "I'm not here to be a victim. I'm here to show that we can stand up to the bias that exists in our society," she said, her voice sounding confident, but at the same time, a note of vulnerability was noticeable. Laura stood, her lips pressed into an angry grimace, her eyes sparkling with irritation. She didn't seem to know what to do in this situation. Amira managed not only to stand her ground, but also to give voice to those who had been silent all the way. Her every glance at the passengers was like a call to action, but the crowd still remained at a loss. Some of the women who sat next to Amina were clearly uncomfortable. They looked at each other, as if searching each other's eyes for approval. "I don't know how to support her," one of them whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "And what happens if she turns out to be wrong?" The words reflected the fear that gripped many. Despite the confusion, in that moment Amira felt her spirit not only strengthened, but began to be transmitted to those around her. It was as if the situation itself was beginning to change. "We are all here to fly towards our purpose, but if we don't protect each other, what is the point of this life?" she said, and now her voice sounded like a melody that filled hearts with courage. Although the vast majority of the passengers still remained in the shadows, some of them began to raise their heads, gathering their courage. It was as if the possibility of change hung in the air. Even if it was faint, Amira sensed that it was now or never, and, gathering her strength, stepped forward, still with unwavering determination. Lara, seeing that her words weren't having the same effect, faltered for a moment, her pride beginning to fray at the seams. She tried to take control again. "You just don't understand what the real working conditions are like in this field. You're not like us." Her words had been let out as an insult, but now they sounded hollow, like an echo in an empty hallway. It was a time when Amira could not only assert her rights, but also address everyone sitting next to her. She took a deep breath and looked back at the passengers and said, "I realize this is difficult for many of you. We're all afraid, and that's okay. But not being afraid is what makes us stronger. If one of us faces injustice, it is up to each of us to support them." Although some were still silent, her words began to change the atmosphere in the cabin. Some of the passengers began to talk, nodding in agreement. Even those who had not originally planned to get involved began to realize that perhaps they too were part of this fight, just without realizing it. The silence in the cabin was still tense, but it was beginning to fill with hope. Amira knew that her voice would not go to waste, and even if Lara remained adamant, she understood that every moment that passed when people began to realize they could make a difference was a valuable step toward change. Every step toward understanding was a step toward liberation. As the silence in the cabin grew thicker and thicker, Amira felt a new wave of determination brewing inside her. For a long time she had tolerated ridicule and humiliation, but now, with every word she uttered, her anger grew. "I can't stay away any longer," she thought. All those years of struggle, those moments of humiliation and the fear of what they would think of her, now filled her with energy like a rushing river. "How much longer do I have to put up with this? How much longer do I have to let you talk to me like this?" she said, directing her gaze at Lara, who didn't seem to have expected such a forceful response. Amira took a step forward, her voice as hard as steel. "You think you can speak to me as an object, but I am not your property. I am a human being, and I have a right to respect." The words sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The passengers began to whisper, feeling the tension grow into something more powerful. Lara, feeling herself being tormented by remorse, tried again to break free. "You don't understand how this works. I'm doing my job," she threw back, trying to maintain the remnants of her dignity. By insulting people, making them feel insignificant. Is that your job?" Amira replied, her voice even louder. And even those who had originally been sitting on the sidelines began to turn around, drawn to this emotional battle. "If you think that by humiliating me, you are somehow increasing your value, you are sorely mistaken. You're actually showing how low your upbringing and human qualities are." The passengers, starting to support her words, began to make slight motions, nodding approvingly. "Wrong, she's right. Quiet voices were heard from different corners of the airplane. These were the seeds of change that were now beginning to germinate. Amira could feel her words becoming a weapon, not just an expression of inner anger. You don't realize what I faced every day. My life is not just a story. It's a series of battles, each one of which has made me who I am. I've built my career, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else throw me any stones along the way, she pronounced, looking confidently into Lara's eyes. The first glimmers of understanding and sympathy began to appear on the faces of the passengers. They began to realize that Amira was fighting not only for herself, but for every one of them who had ever faced humiliation and prejudice. This struggle became a common cause, and a new energy, the energy of unity, hung in the air. Amira, watching the reactions of the people around her, realized that this moment was a turning point. She was no longer alone. We all have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. And if you can't show it to others, it means you don't understand what it means to be human, she said with confidence, and her voice sounded like a powerful cry of truth. As if on cue, some of the passengers began to applaud. The sound seemed to shake his world, awakening hope. Yes, they were witnessing more than conflict, they were part of the change. Lara, realizing that control was slipping from her grasp, took a step back, her eyes showing signs of confusion. She could feel her confidence melting before her eyes, and the tension she was building began to seem unnatural. I'm just doing my job, she murmured, and her voice no longer held the confidence it had at first. It was a vulnerable admission, and even her most loyal followers were beginning to doubt her validity. Amira took a step forward, not giving Lara a chance to leave. If your job is to humiliate people, it might be worth considering whether this role is right for you. We can all make a choice of respect, understanding, and unity, she said, now as an agent of change. As if in answer to her call, a loud voice from behind her came from one of the passengers. It's not just about her, it's about all of us. These words brought a new flood of approval. Every passenger who had ever experienced humiliation or prejudice became part of this moment. This was not just a mere struggle, it was their struggle together. The power of this moment was hard to overestimate. The fear and confusion that had held the passengers back for so long began to dissolve like ice in the spring sun. Now they all felt it, the opportunity to make a difference and show that inequality and bias had no place in their world was in their hands. Amira felt like the struggle was just beginning, but already in that moment she realized that her voice, her story, and her determination were powerful tools that could help create space for change. They were there to support each other, to leave no one alone with their suffering. I am here to expose the truth, to remind each and every one of us that human dignity is not just words, but something worth fighting for, and I will fight to the end, she concluded. And this challenge was not only her personal victory, but also the beginning of a new journey for everyone on that plane. Lara stood as if utterly confused, her expression changing from arrogance to open bewilderment. Her usual control, that powerful shield she used to protect herself from any critical glances, had now collapsed. She couldn't believe that someone like Amira dared to confront her so openly, and even in the presence of the other passengers. What do you mean by your accomplishments? You're not one of us, she pronounced, her voice trembling with bewilderment. Amira felt the fire boiling inside her again. Not one of you. What makes you think I have no right to be here among you? I own this airline, she said, her voice sounding confident and irresistible. Her every syllable reflected the passion and struggle she had faced throughout her life. Lara looked at Amira, dumbfounded, as if trying to understand how this was possible. Her arrogance, based on stereotypes and prejudice, collided with a truth that was so obvious it was impossible to ignore. The owner, you, she asked, bewildered, her words sounding like a whisper, as if she was trying to find a clue to her conviction. You're just a black woman. What good could your past be? Those words struck like lightning, reminding everyone of the deep bias they were facing. Amira felt her inner tension building, but in that moment, she decided she wasn't going to walk away from the truth. My skin color is only part of my identity. I have fought against prejudice, against discrimination, and I have risen higher than many of you could ever imagine, she said, her voice now more powerful, as if energized. Passengers watching this struggle began to realize that there was more going on here than just an argument between a flight attendant and a female passenger. It was a demonstration of the resilience and courage that many people face when the world turns against them. Each of them felt this truth that seemed to fill the space around them. I worked days and nights to achieve my goals. I built my airline from the ground up. My experience and my determination is what defines me, not my skin color, Amira said, her words sounding like an anthem for the fight for equality and justice. Lara, unsure how to respond to this statement, tried again to take control of the situation. But you don't look like normal airline owners. You don't fit the image we all know, she said, a note of arrogance in her voice, as if she was trying to return to a familiar role. Amira felt her anger rising, but instead of getting into it, she took a deep breath and decided to use this moment as a learning opportunity. My appearance and my skin color do not define who I am. It is your preconceived notions and expectations that prevent you from seeing the truth. I am here to show you that diversity is not a weakness but a strength, she said, and her words were full of determination and confidence. The passengers began to whisper, their eyes glistening with a new spark of understanding. This situation, previously seemingly the only one, was now suddenly a platform for true change. Lara felt her confidence begin to falter. This deception she had created around herself was beginning to crack at the seams. Lara, trying to take refuge behind her earlier stance, took a step back. I'm just telling it like is. That's not what I mean. There was a fear in her voice that she couldn't hide. You have no right to talk about what it's like to own a company. You don't know what it's like to be in a place where every decision you make matters. Amira felt her words becoming more and more powerful. I know exactly what it means to be at the top and also to be at the bottom. And I also know that each of us is entitled to respect, no matter what we look like or where we come from. And it is that respect that we must show each other, she said, her voice beginning to sound like a menacing call for justice. Lara, finding herself in a difficult situation, realized that she was losing control not only of herself, but also of the situation. Her arrogance began to crumble before her eyes, and even those who had once supported her now began to show their displeasure. We are not here to judge each other. We are here to fly into the future together, and that future should be based on respect, Amira said, her words sounding like a vow of unity. At that moment, each of the passengers, each of those watching this scene, began to realize that they could be part of something bigger than just a fight between two women. Lara, who had lost her arrogance, now stood in disbelief, and Amira, gaining the upper hand, felt that her voice truly had power. In that moment, she knew that her struggle was not only her personal victory, but also a step toward the culture change that needed to happen in every corner of their society. Amira looked at the reactions of the passengers, who seemed startled by her words. The atmosphere in the cabin was filled with tension, but at the same time, also with some kind of release. Each of them felt that they had witnessed something important, and it was certainly moving into a new phase of their shared experience. Lara, unable to deal with the storm brewing around her, tried again to regain control. You can't just talk about it like it's true, she said, though her voice sounded uncertain now, as if she'd already realized that her arguments had lost their force. Amira didn't let herself back down. You still don't understand, do you? Let me tell you a little bit about myself, she said, her voice becoming calm but full of determination. This was her moment, and she was going to make the most of it. I grew up in a disadvantaged neighborhood where people of color were often denied equal opportunity. Since childhood, I watched my father, despite his incredible work and dedication, face racism and bias in his career. These memories became my sources of inspiration. She began, her words carrying the weight of the past and hope for the future. Lara, not knowing how to react to this story, remained silent, but her eyes gave away her fear. Amira continued, after graduation, I made the decision to start my own company. I knew I had to prove to myself and everyone around me that we, as black women, can achieve greatness. And here I stand before you as the owner of this airline, and I have no idea how much it humbles me, she said, and her eyes met the eyes of those around her. The passengers frowned in anticipation, listening to her every word. This woman, whom Lara had tried to humiliate, turned out to be not just a passenger, but a real winner, standing at the top of her industry. Amira continued, I've been through a lot of trials and obstacles, but I didn't let that stop me, and I am here to remind you that true strength lies in unity and respect. The shock that had gripped Lara was now evident. She clearly hadn't expected her victim to prove to be such a stalwart opponent. But you don't look like an airline owner, she said, her voice trembling with a note of confusion. Amira grinned, but there was no malice in her smile. Once again, you are judging what you see and not what is real. I hope you realize that there are many people in our world who hide their accomplishments and potential under a mask that is forced upon them. In that moment, Amira realized that this was not just her personal victory, but an opportunity to change the perception not only of Lara, but of all the other passengers. Her story was exactly what would inspire the others. She noticed some of them began to nod, realizing that they too had become part of this struggle. Each of us has a story. I hope that someday we will have the opportunity to share them without fear of being judged. This incident could be a turning point not only for me, but for all of you. We should all be proud of who we are, she said, her voice sounding like a cry of hope. A quiet discussion began among the passengers, and soon many of them began to share their stories. This woman, who had become an object of ridicule, was now more than just a woman. She had become a symbol of struggle, respect, and fortitude. Lara, lost in her thoughts, realized that her former life of prejudice and arrogance could lose all meaning. She looked at Amira and realized that her story was just the beginning, and now she needed to change her perception. I didn't know, Lara said, her voice low and almost inaudible. In that moment, she realized that she needed to change her attitude, not only towards Amira, but also towards the people around her. Amira, noticing the powerful change behind her words, decided that this moment needed to be seized. If you want the world to be a better place, start with yourself. Each of us can make a difference. Let's create a future where no one is judged for who they are. We all deserve respect, she said, and her voice sounded like a dream of the world they all wanted to see. Everyone now realized that this flight was not just a journey, but an opportunity to change their lives forever. Like an explosive wave, Amira's words continued to spread through the cabin, filling the space with new understanding and awareness. Passengers who had previously simply watched the scene with unwilling awareness began to feel the weight of their inaction. They realized that their silence had become part of this systemic bias, and now they could not ignore their part in this strange spectacle. Some of them were whispering, discussing how they had allowed themselves to be part of this atmosphere of arrogance, when they could have simply stood up for Amira. A couple of the passengers seated behind her, white men in business ties, exchanged glances full of embarrassment. We should have done something, one of them said, his voice full of remorse. Other passengers began to realize that their own stories of prejudice and discrimination had also taken place in their lives, albeit in different forms. One woman sitting in the third row recalled how her own parents had judged people who were different from them, and how she had felt uncomfortable when she first encountered racism, but had remained silent, not knowing how to respond. Now that the situation was unfolding before her eyes, she realized that silence was not just passive observation, but active acceptance of injustice. Amira, noticing the changes in the faces of the passengers, felt her own confidence grow. She realized that this moment could be the beginning of something bigger, not just for her, but for everyone around her. I want you to reflect on how often we leave ignorance unanswered, how often we allow ourselves to be part of a system that punishes people for simply being themselves, she said, her voice softer yet full of strength. Some passengers nodded in agreement, their eyes shining with a new awareness. They realized that this was not just a matter of racism, it was a matter of human dignity. Amira continued, each of you here can make a difference in your lives. You can be the ones who speak up, who advocate, who listen. This is exactly what I hope to see in the future. We all need to be able to say, this is unacceptable, and then the world will be a better place. Amira's words, filled with sincerity and understanding, penetrated the hearts of the passengers. They began to realize that their choices, their silence or actions mattered, and it was a turning point when they realized that they each had the power to choose how to respond to bias, and that they could choose to be fair. Lara, still in her seat, felt her own heart begin to change. She could no longer deny that her behavior was wrong. She realized that her arrogance had become a defense mechanism that ultimately led to the humiliation of another person. Although it was hard for her to accept, she knew that change had to start with her. I should have realized that behind every face I judge there is a story, she said, her voice quiet but confident, and with that thought, hope crept into her heart. I want to learn, I want to understand, I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Amira, seeing Lara open up, felt her heart fill with compassion. She realized that the path to change might be difficult, but it was possible. All of us can change. And I'm not here to judge, but to share my story and how I overcame challenges, she said, her words a heartfelt call to unite. The passengers began to exchange views, and soon the conversations became more open. One of the men sitting on the opposite edge stood up and talked about how he had witnessed bias in his business. He talked about his own mistakes and how he now realized the need for change. With each new story and each new realization brought them all together, people began to realize that inequality is not just an issue that affects individuals. It is an issue that affects us all. We can create a society that respects the rights and dignity of every human being, said one of the passengers, and others began to support him. So a real transformation took place on board that airplane. It was not just a flight from one point to another. It was a journey of understanding, respect, and unity. Passengers began to feel their hearts opening to the new. It was a realization that their actions could change the world around them, even if they had never encountered bias themselves. Amira, looking at the people, realized that this moment was just the beginning. She hoped that this incident would be the catalyst for change, not only in their lives, but in the lives of the entire company. Now they had to move forward, with the knowledge that each of them had the opportunity to create a better future. Let's become a voice that speaks the truth, she said, and her words were the beginning of a new era for everyone on board. In that moment, the plane not only took off, but also took on a new life, a life filled with hope and a desire for change. Lara, still feeling on the verge of change, turned to the stewardess, who seemed completely confused by what was happening. Lara's face reflected a sincere desire for understanding and the possibility of redemption, but the stewardess' eyes showed only deafening incomprehension and stubbornness. "You've got it all wrong," Lara exclaimed, her voice trembling with tension. "I was just joking around. You know how it is on airplanes, everyone relaxes and starts joking." She tried to straighten things out, but her words sounded increasingly unconvincing, as if she herself didn't believe what she was saying. Amira, noticing her confusion, uttered, "It's not just a joke, it's a humiliation. You can't just treat people like that based on their looks or accent." Her voice was full of dignity, and there wasn't an ounce of aggression in it. She knew this moment was a chance for Lara to change her perception, but she couldn't afford to indulge in a lie. Lara, realizing that her excuses were not resonating with the others, became even more agitated. She started shouting unintelligible phrases, trying to hurt some of the passengers to divert attention away from herself. "And who are you to judge? Maybe you're not that great," she threw back at Amira, trying to project her views onto her. Passengers began whispering, discussing how the flight attendant, instead of accepting her guilt, was trying to bite back. "How can she talk like that? Her behavior is just unacceptable," came a voice from the crowd. Other passengers began to confirm that the laughter and jokes that once seemed harmless had now taken on a darker tone. Lara was losing control more and more. "You just don't understand what it means to work for an airline. Sometimes we have to defuse the situation," she shrieked, but her words only reinforced the negative perception. Passengers who didn't like her behavior began shouting, demanding that she be removed from the flight. "No one should suffer because of your indiscretion," said a woman from the end of the row. Amira looked at Lara, her heart overflowing with compassion. "You must realize that your words have consequences. Even if you had no malicious intent, it doesn't excuse your behavior. I don't want you to just disappear, but I want you to learn and grow," she uttered, sincerely hoping that Lara could hear her. Amira's words touched many of the passengers, and they began to agree with her. "She is right. We should all take responsibility for our words," commented one of the women sitting nearby. "Let's make this a lesson for all of us." However, Lara couldn't stop herself from further trying to justify herself. She began to talk about what it was like to be a flight attendant, about how hard she worked, and how she needed to keep a positive spirit in the team. "I just wanted everyone to feel comfortable," she repeated, but her voice was losing strength and her words could no longer contain her anger and fear. Gradually the crowd began to respond. "Comfort should not come at the expense of humiliating others," uttered one of the men sitting in the middle of the saloon. He was the same man who had been silent up to this point, but now decided to speak out. "You must realize that jokes about race have never been acceptable." Lara frowned, realizing that her defenses had crumbled. and she found herself in the middle of judgment. The passengers began to glance around, each realizing that their shared experience on this flight had become something much more than just a collection of random events. They had become part of a movement that could begin the process of change. Each of Laura's failed attempts to justify herself only reinforced the condemnation against her. The passengers felt their own silence during this flight turn against themselves. Now they could no longer remain silent. They finally realized the importance of not just defending themselves, but standing up for the truth. "It's time to stop this endless spiral of bias," Amiga said, her voice sounding confident and calm. "I'm not here to judge you, but I want each of us to stand up and say enough is enough. We deserve respect, and it starts with ourselves." With these words, she raised her hand, and the passengers began to rise one by one, supporting her. At this moment, they were not only protecting her, but also defending their own rights and dignity. Laura, seeing this, realized that now her words had become empty, and although deep down she felt guilt, she also felt that this experience was a chance for her to change. The confusion that had once reigned in the cabin was replaced by an atmosphere of unity. Everyone realized that this flight would be an important lesson for them, and that together they could overcome any obstacle. Amira stood at the center of attention, her eyes glowing with confidence and strength. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a true leader in this moment, the embodiment of hope and resilience. While Laura, full of confusion, tried to justify herself, Amiga took charge of the situation and confidently steered the conversation in a constructive direction. "We're all here to travel, to explore the world, and to connect with people, but to do that, we need respect," she said, her voice coming through loud and clear, filling every corner of the cabin. "Each of us has the right to feel safe and dignified, regardless of skin color or accent. No joke can justify humiliating another human being." Despite Laura's panicked state, the assembled passengers began to speak their minds. Some even began to support Amira's, raising their hands in agreement. "She's right. We all deserve respect," uttered one of the men standing nearby. "Stop being silent. Let's learn to be a voice for those who are trying to be belittled." Laura stood there, not knowing what to do. Her attempts to humiliate Amira's and defend herself had backfired on her. The passengers no longer looked at her with sympathy now. They saw her as a representative of prejudice, and Amira's as a symbol of strength and resilience. This dynamic became noticeable even to herself, as she could feel her voice beginning to fade. Amira, seeing that her words were beginning to resonate, continued, "I want everyone here to know that bias and discrimination have no place in our society. We must be united in our fight for equality." Her words were simple but determined, and they touched the hearts of those who listened. The crowd, gaining courage, began to rise from their seats, cheering Amira on. "We must unite and protect each other," uttered one of the women standing at the end of the row. "This is not just a problem of one individual. It is a problem of the whole community." Her words echoed in the hearts of many, and it created an atmosphere of unity. Laura, at a loss, began to realize that her actions had led to division rather than unity. She could see the other passengers embracing each other, exchanging looks of understanding and support. "Why didn't I see this before?" she thought, her heart filled with regret. But at the same time, she realized she could be better. Maybe this lesson was for her to learn to be more open and respectful. Amira, sensing the growing unity, continued, "True leaders are those who are able to hear and support others, regardless of their background. It's not just words, it's actions. If we want to change the world around us, we must start with ourselves." Her confidence was contagious, and each of the passengers began to realize their strength as a group. Laura, who had been feeling isolated and misunderstood, suddenly felt something inside her begin to change. "Maybe I should try talking to them," she thought, but she was scared. Fear of judgment and prejudice filled her mind. However, seeing how supportive people were of Amir, she realized that this could be her chance. "I want to say," she said, but her voice stuck on her tongue. The passengers turned to her, waiting to see what she would say. "I want to apologize," she finally uttered, her words sincere. "I made a mistake. I didn't think about how my words might affect others." Amira, seeing Laura trying to talk about her feelings, felt she was on the right track. "This is a start, and it takes courage to admit your mistakes and learn from them," she said, her voice remaining calm and supportive. Laura, encouraged by the support, continued, I realized that you can't let fear control you. I want to learn how to be a better person. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Her words were a true confession, and it sparked a new wave of approval among the passengers. With each passing second, the tension in the cabin eased, and more people began to feel part of something bigger. This was not just a flight. It was an opportunity to change themselves and perhaps the world around them. Amira, surrounded by support, felt that a true leader is not only someone who leads, but someone who inspires others to do the same. The passengers began to swap stories about their own experiences and struggles with prejudice. Each of them realized that they were all bound together by a common goal to create a world where no one would feel humiliated or misunderstood. In that moment, everyone on the plane witnessed how one person can inspire others, how true leadership can emerge in the most unexpected places. This flight became more than just a crossing of boundaries. It was a journey of self-awareness, respect, and unity. As a wave of support and understanding swept over the entire salon, Amira felt that the moment should be seized. She gathered her thoughts and, taking a step forward, decided to make a speech that she thought would leave a deep mark in the hearts of all present. "Dear passengers," she began, her voice sounding confident yet soft, as if she wanted to touch every heart on this plane. "Today we have witnessed not just a conflict, but an important lesson. A lesson that bias and racism have no right to exist in our society. No matter where we are, whether on the ground or in the air, everyone's eyes were fixed on her, and she could feel the tension slowly fading away, giving way to attention and respect. Each of us is an individual deserving of respect, regardless of skin color, accent, or any other attribute. We are all different, but it is in our diversity that our strength lies. If we view each other only through the lens of bias, we miss the opportunity to see the beauty and richness of the human experience." Amira continued, her words resonating by the minute. "I want to call you to action. We need to not just condemn racism and bias, but to act against it. We need to question how our words and actions affect others. We can make the world a better place if we try to understand, support, and respect each other. If we don't stay silent when we see injustice, we can create a brighter future for everyone." Some passengers began to rise from their seats, applauding, while others just listened, knowing that this moment was important. Amika felt that her words were beginning to resonate in people's hearts, that they were already beginning to change their point of view and attitudes. "When I look at you, I see not just passengers, but people who can make a difference in this world. Each of us has the power and opportunity to influence the reality around us. It's not an easy journey, but it's worth it. We need to come together and be a voice for those who can't speak up and support those who face bias and humiliation. We can and must be better than just silent observers." Her words had a powerful effect on the people around her. The passengers began to exchange glances, many of them realizing that this was an opportunity for them to begin to change. Amika could feel how this moment united them, creating a unique atmosphere of unity and understanding. "Remember," she continued, "each of us is capable of more. Don't let fear or insecurity stop you from being who you are. Let's work together to create a world where respect and understanding become the norm. Together we can overcome any obstacles and create a life full of love and support." Amira paused for a moment, giving everyone a chance to consider her words. She knew she couldn't change the world in one day, but if even one person changed their behavior, it would be a victory. Her heart fluttered with hope and faith in the people around her. Finally, she finished. "I ask you, as you leave this plane, think about how you can be part of the solution. Be the ones who support, who teach, and who speak up. Let's make this world a better place for everyone, where everyone can feel safe and dignified." The passengers, filled with inspiration and new understanding, began to applaud, and this applause filled the plane with energy. It was not just the end of the flight, it was the beginning of something new, a new path to a brighter future. Lara, standing in the crowd, felt her heart fill with gratitude. She realized that those words had changed her perception, and she could no longer remain in the shadow of her fears. She now had the opportunity to be part of the solution, not the problem. In that moment, she felt that this was her chance for redemption. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers, inspired by Amira's speech, began to discuss their own ideas and intentions. The flight was not just a journey through the air, but a journey of understanding, respect, and unity that left an indelible mark on the hearts of all who were on board. After Amira's powerful speech, a special atmosphere prevailed in the salon. People started discussing among themselves, exchanging opinions and feelings. The passengers who had been sitting in silence were now talking animatedly, their voices growing louder and more confident. "You know, I never really thought about how my words might hurt others," one of the middle-aged men began, his voice sounding slightly awkward. "This situation made me realize how easy it is to allow bias without even realizing it. I thought I was just observing, but now I realize that silence is also a choice." The woman sitting next to him nodded in agreement. "I agree. We often think racism is something distant, something that only affects others, but it's actually part of our society. And if we remain indifferent, we become complicit." The discussion turned into a real support group. People started sharing their stories. Someone recalled how he had been abused as a child. Someone told how his prejudices made him ashamed of his origins. Amira stood and listened, her heart filled with warmth as people began to realize that their experiences were important and that they could change the way they saw the world. "I grew up surrounded by prejudice and racism," said a young woman sitting at the end of the row. "Every day I heard insults and discontent, but when I started talking openly about it, my life changed. I learned to fight for my rights and support others." Her words inspired those around her, and they began talking about how they could act to create a more just world. Lara, standing in the midst of the group, felt her own perception change. She began to realize that this lesson was a milestone not only for her, but for everyone present. "We can all be the ones to make a difference," she said, feeling a surge of confidence. "If we notice injustice and speak out against it, we can create a safe space for everyone." With each new voice in the group, with each story, the passengers' attitudes toward racism and prejudice became more conscious. People began to open up to each other, as if removing the shackles of misunderstanding. This flight, which began with rudeness and humiliation, was now a place of awakening and unity. "I think we can all do our part," one of the older men said, his voice sounding with authority. "Maybe we can start by talking to our family and friends about what we've learned here. Don't let this lesson be forgotten. Let's remember that each of us is a human being with rights and feelings." Amira, being in the center of this transformation, felt her heart fill with pride. She realized that the lesson they had all learned was much more important than just a verbal altercation. It was a lesson about humanity, about understanding, and about the importance of supporting each other in the fight against bias. As we leave this airplane, let's remember that these are not just words. It is our actions that define who we are, she added, addressing the group. Let's try to be active participants in creating a world where everyone feels safe and worthy. Sounds of approval begin to echo all around. Passengers began to raise their voices in agreement and support. These words were a new beginning, a new course for all present. In that moment, they all realized that they could no longer be mere observers. They had become part of something bigger, part of a movement that strives for equality and justice. Each of them felt their importance in this struggle, and they decided that this lesson would stay with them forever. Sitting in their chairs, they suddenly felt this common struggle connect them. People who were once mere strangers have become friends, like-minded, willing to work together for the common good. This flight not only changed their perspectives, but also brought them together, creating a community ready for action. In the end, they all knew that the lesson they had learned would follow them throughout their lives, and it was a lesson they would gladly share with others. Amira smiled, realizing that she had done more than just protect herself. She had inspired an entire group of people to begin the journey of change. When the plane finally landed, passengers began to get up and gather their belongings. But the atmosphere in the cabin was different. Conversations about what had happened continued, and many of them exchanged phone numbers to stay in touch and support each other. Amira, standing at the exit, felt that this moment was not just the end of the flight, but the beginning of a new stage in her life and in the lives of the other passengers. However, while one part of this flight had come to an end, another was just beginning to unfold. The stewardess, who had remained in the shadows of all that had happened, stood at the exit, her face expressing confusion and anger. She still didn't realize how profound her actions had been, and though she was about to leave, there were consequences. As soon as people started to get off the plane, a group of passengers approached the flight attendant, who had previously witnessed everything that had happened. They could not remain indifferent to what had happened. The words began to come out louder and more confidently. "It was unacceptable," one woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We cannot allow such things to happen in our community. Someone needs to be held accountable for their actions." A general consensus grew among the passengers, and soon the group decided to file a formal complaint about the flight attendant's behavior. They realized that this was not just a matter of insults, but a need to ensure respect and safety for all passengers, regardless of their race. Meanwhile, as Amira left the plane, she felt that everything that had happened had been an important turning point in her life. Her confidence was strengthened, and she knew she would continue to fight for the rights of those who face bias and racism. But now she was not alone. She had the support of a community that had just been formed. When Amira came out of the terminal, she was met by several journalists who had managed to learn about her story. They were ready to ask questions about the incident and how she was feeling afterwards. Amira, inspired by the support of her new friends, began to share her story with the journalists, emphasizing the importance of fighting bias and the need for respect for each other. While Amira was becoming a symbol of the fight for equality, the flight attendant met the reality of her actions. Her behavior was not just improper, it was the cause of a complaint that soon caught the attention of the airline's management. After a thorough review of the incident, she was announced disciplinary action. The flight attendant realized that her arrogance and bias had led to consequences she could never have predicted. She faced the consequences of her actions, losing not only her job, but also the respect of many who witnessed her behavior. The realization that her words and actions matter came too late, and it was a bitter lesson for her. Amira, meanwhile, was recognized for her courage. Communities and organizations advocating for equality began inviting her to participate in various events and conferences. She became an activist. Her voice became heard on social media, and she used this platform to inspire others to fight for equality. Every time Amira shared her story, she reminded everyone that it is important to speak out against bias and hate. She turned to her experience to help others realize that no one should remain in the shadows and suffer humiliation. In the end, the lesson that was learned from this incident became an example for many. Passengers who went through the experience began to take action in their communities, supporting each other and raising their voices against racism and prejudice. Amira has become a symbol of change, and her story has inspired many people to begin the journey towards understanding and respect. This is how the flight ended, but it left a deep mark in the hearts of all those on board. It wasn't just a flight, it was a transformation that lived on beyond the plane, reminding everyone of the importance of fighting for justice and respect for every human being. Thank you for spending this time with us and learning about this important story. Your opinion is very important to us. Share in the comments what you think about the situation described in this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? How have you dealt with such situations? Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we appreciate your support and participation. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel so we can continue to share important stories with you. We wish you a good day.